Now, to introduce this afternoon's first speaker, another TR Scholar student, Dustin Sandbach.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dustin Sandbach. I am a senior from Billings, Montana, majoring in exercise science and physical education with a minor in leadership. Today, I have the honor of introducing you to Dr. Michael Patrick Cullinane, who is currently a professor at Northumbria University. His substantial knowledge of Theodore Roosevelt helped him contribute to a book called A Companion for Theodore Roosevelt. Within that book, a major theme is the relationship between Theodore Roosevelt and motion pictures. The book points out the importance of that relationship when it states, conceivably, the medium that has most shaped and reshaped his image since his death is the motion picture. Its ability to reach massive audiences in living rooms or cinemas, its stimulation of visual senses, and since the 1920s, auditory senses, and its unsuspecting capacity as entertainment rather than an interpretive representation make motion pictures a collective experience, easy to recall, and effective in branding character. Now, as a historian, Dr. Cullinane most enjoys his archival work. In fact, even though we are in the digital age, Dr. Cullinane would rather prefer getting his hands on the journals and that, as opposed to the physical or the digital copies we have today, such as you can get on your Kindle or your web browsers. But on one final note, Dr. Cullinane is also an avid baseball fan. In fact, his favorite team is the New York Yankees. So I can only imagine this year was especially enjoyable watching the Boston Red Sox win it all. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Patrick Cullinane to the stage.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, I just need to say a quick thank you to DSU for being so incredibly generous and warm. This is such a great place. It's my first time here, and Clay and Sharon have made it just such an enjoyable experience that I know I'll be back, and hopefully very soon. Let me just get this fixed, and we'll talk about movies and television then. Right. Okay, well, I don't know why it's not working. Am I missing something? No. No, it needs to be blown up there. Yeah, but it's...
Kathy?
Well, I can start anyway, because I know we're on a tight schedule. The high school students need to get going probably. But I want to talk about TR and film. There's two things that I want to do today, because there's sort of two aspects of TR and film that are important. One is TR in film, which we're going to take a look at shortly once this works. And I'll show you some footage of TR himself in motion pictures. But the second side of this coin is TR and his image in film. And so what we'll look at is the almost a century of representations, depictions, portrayals of Theodore Roosevelt in motion pictures, so TV and movies. Okay. There we go. Perfect. Cheers. Okay, thanks. Right, so TR in film. There we go. The man at Oyster Bay, Long Island, rowing his boat across the bay. And then TR, his image in film. That's not him, right? That's Robin Williams, A Night at the Museum, 2006 blockbuster film. Historically, very inaccurate. A lot of fun for a lot of different reasons in terms of interpretation, though. To start with Theodore Roosevelt in film, the best source is, and I say this with a caveat, the Library of Congress collection of films about, with Theodore Roosevelt in them. And the caveat is this, that the DSU TR Center now is compiling all of these motion pictures and are going to host them on their digital archive as well. And that is another real reason why we should support that project. A little bit about this TR collection and him in film. It is the product of two memorial associations, a men's memorial association and a women's memorial association. After TR died in 1919, the Men's Memorial Association begged and borrowed and bought films all over the United States and formed a Bureau of Roosevelt Information and Propaganda to distribute these films to people around the United States. For the Women's Memorial Association's part, when they opened up the birthplace, the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace in Manhattan, they hosted this material. And on the fourth floor of that building, there's an auditorium where they could screen for up to 300 people these movies. So the two organizations worked together to bring film to Roosevelt in film to the masses in the United States. Now in 1962, the birthplace closes, or I shouldn't say it closes, it transfers ownership from the memorial associations to the National Park Service. And so the National Park Service got this material and said, well, we're not best equipped to show this to America anymore, and they pass it on to the Library of Congress, and that's where it sits today, with the exception, as I said, of the TR Center having it now. Now, the one thing I want to say about this collection and what makes it so important is its comprehensiveness. This is all of the images that we know of Theodore Roosevelt on film. There's contextual elements of this that are really important. For example, there's other dignitaries, world dignitaries that you can see in this. There are other presidents like Taft and Wilson that are in this collection. But most importantly, it gives you a new sense of who Theodore Roosevelt is in a way that reading his books or even reading his letters can't do. But there's a problem with this as well. The image of Theodore Roosevelt is what he wants you to see. And the important thing about this collection is what is not there as much as what is there. So you'll see in the collection Roosevelt going to a baseball game, which, great, I love that, you know, or a football game for that matter. But what you won't see is Theodore Roosevelt in his tennis costume playing tennis, because that wasn't a masculine sport, and he didn't want to be portrayed in that way. And so we have to remember what isn't there in this collection. For example, this is one of the films. This is 1912, Roosevelt riding around Oyster Bay on his horse. It's a very masculine image. He plays with dogs later on. He grins at this at the end of this clip to the cameraman and sort of says something. I wish I had a lip reader, but he says something along the lines of, "Are we done now?" I mean, so this is a conscientious decision to be portrayed in this manner. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about is what happens after he dies. And this is, for me, where things get a little bit more interesting in terms of how Roosevelt has been portrayed, not by himself, but by others. And I've broken this into 5 different categories as a means of sort of giving us something to talk about, as a means of problematizing the way Roosevelt has been depicted. It's not meant to be a rigid periodization of how he's been depicted. And I say that because in all of these eras, there are very different ways in which he's portrayed. There's about 100 different movies and probably about 50 different television shows, at least full television shows, that depict Roosevelt in a major way. And I break them into silent films in the early, the first depictions of Roosevelt, a revisionist era in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the Cold War Cowboy I'm going to talk a little bit about in the 50s, 60s, 70s, some documentaries in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and then I'm going to try and pick your brain a little bit in a way and find out what you think about the Roosevelt image as it is today and where we might be going. I think we're on the cusp of potentially a new view of Roosevelt and one in which we haven't really seen in motion pictures before. So let me start off with silent films and short films. And what I really want to say about this period is we're talking about the deification of Roosevelt in this era. This is when tributes about Roosevelt are being disseminated all over the world, and they are incredibly laudatory. There is very little negative representation of Roosevelt in these films or in the tributes that come out immediately after his death. And I want to kind of be a little bit provocative and say that there are 5 major themes in which he's portrayed in these early films that carry over into later years as well. So one is Americanism, which was a big buzzword in 1919, not so much nowadays, but nevertheless meant things like a very strong civic ideology of democracy, liberty, things that maybe back in the time would have been anti-immigrant or certainly anti-communist at least. That's a big theme here, as is the cowboy figure. The frontier myth of a cowboy is a major theme, as is 3 others: progressive Roosevelt, conservationist Roosevelt, and the last one, which is kind of a blend of 2, the man of letters or preacher of righteousness image. And all of these come out in films, and the one I had to use for this presentation was this one. If you've not seen it, it's called Through the Roosevelt Country with Roosevelt's Friends. If any of you haven't seen this already, I would be amazed. But this is Medora 100 years ago, more or less, 1919, Medora. And the shots are incredible. I've been talking to Clay about this film quite a bit. That's an aerial view of the city, which I'm sure is a lot different from today. And then the Main Street view of Medora with the feed store, and then all the way when you get to the end, you'll see the Rough Riders Hotel, where some of you might even be staying on this trip. It's an amazing film because it's incredibly crisp and clean, but also because you'll see in a second, the director, Herman Hagedorn, interviews some of Roosevelt's friends when he lived in North Dakota. And the interviews are incredible in terms of the memories that people have. They capture it, like oral history does, what people thought about Roosevelt in 1919, but also their memories of him in the past. But more importantly, they cast him as a rugged frontiersman. That's what this movie does. And it ties it in with that theme of Americanism. So being able to learn about America's civic ideology being able to engage with the frontier made him more of an American in a way. And it gave him this exceptional spirit and sense of American democracy, a gritty determination about life, the strenuous life. So this film picks up on those first 2 themes I was talking about Americanism and the cowboy spirit. Other films would depict him in a variety of different ways in the 1920s. This one, Our Teddy, comes out 2 weeks after he dies. It's not a posthumous film because it is produced with the help of Theodore Roosevelt, but it's a film about him being a preacher, really, and preaching about World War I and American intervention in that war. And it celebrates him for that very fact, as well as you can see here his 4 sons, including Quentin, who's got a gold star because, of course, he dies in the war. So that one depicts very much that preacher view. The Rough Riders revives the interventionist American cowboy spirit, and I Love the Woman and Little Old New York talk an awful lot about Roosevelt's progressive credentials, including conservationism. So these films, they take up where tributes left off. They rehash and reiterate many of the themes that are in the tributes that Americans were making to Theodore Roosevelt in these years. But that changes. Come 1931, we see a major revision of Theodore Roosevelt, both in terms of the historiography, but also in terms of motion pictures. So you should be familiar, you might be familiar with Henry Pringle's book, the 1931 biography of Theodore Roosevelt, which turns the tables on what Americans think about TR. He's now an adolescent, juvenile, bombastic, hasty, a very different figure than the 1920s had depicted him as. And that begins to feed into Americans' perceptions of TR during the 1930s. And I want to show you a quick clip of a film that came out in the 1940s, 1944 to be exact, but was a screenplay before that, a theater production called Arsenic and Old Lace, where Theodore Roosevelt, you're laughing because you're going to see a few clips that I put together about this, about a man who thinks he's Theodore Roosevelt. And he's a nincompoop. He's nuts, literally nuts. He gets, spoiler alert, he goes to an insane asylum after this, the movie ends. Here we go.
Oh, come right in, Mr. Brophy.
Miss Abby, we came for the toys.
Oh, yes.
This is Officer O'Hara. He's taking over my beat. How do you do, Mr.
Well, welcome to our neighborhood, Mr. O'Hara.
Gentlemen, what news have you brought me?
Colonel, we have nothing to report. Huh? Oh, no. Absolutely nothing to report.
Splendid. Thank you, gentlemen. At ease.
You know the Reverend Dr. Harper from the church next door?
Sure. Hello, Reverend. This is Officer O'Hara, the new man on the beat.
How do you do, sir? It's nice to meet you.
The toys are on the chair up here by the library door. Oh, Teddy, will you run upstairs and bring down your Army and Navy from Aunt Martha's room? They're all packed.
That's splendid work you men do, fixing up discarded toys for the kids at camp.
Now, Teddy, you promised me you wouldn't do that anymore.
But I have to call a cabinet meeting to get the release of those supplies.
Now, don't do that again. Do you hear me?
Where I must be going.
Charge! Charge the blockhouse!
Blockhouse?
Oh, the stairs are always San Juan Hill.
Hello, Mortimer.
How are you, Mr. President?
Bully. Thank you, just bully. What news have you brought me?
Just this, Mr. President. The country is squarely behind you.
Yes, I know. Isn't it wonderful? Well, goodbye. I'm off to Panama.
Goodbye, Mr. President.
A new lot for the canal, you know. Oh, tell the news to Mother. Yes, Doctor, I'll run for a third term, but I won't be elected. And that'll mean the last of the Roosevelts in the White House.
That's what you think.
It's a really good ending, especially because, of course, we know there's another Roosevelt in the White House, but this is released in 1944. He's still there. And also because it is his cousin that begins to overshadow Roosevelt in many ways during the 1930s and 40s. As one historian wrote, there was another Roosevelt, and he absolutely was not a Republican. And so I need to tell you a little bit about this guy, Sidney Blackmer, who during the period of Franklin Roosevelt's tenure as president acts in seven motion picture productions, one on television, 6 in cinemas. Blackmer probably should be called the Blackmer era because he depicts him in such a variety of ways. He just shows how malleable Theodore Roosevelt can be as an image. And I'm going to give you 2 examples of this. In 1939, the Monroe Doctrine is released, and in 1940, Teddy the Rough Rider is released. And what's remarkable about these films is that they are produced within a year of each other. They have the same actor, Sidney Blackmer, as portraying Roosevelt. They are the same format. They are 20-minute short films, and they are produced by the same company, Warner Brothers. And that man in particular is behind these 2 films. That's Jack Warner, the head of the studio. Jack Warner is a diehard Republican. He also happens to be a diehard Franklin Roosevelt fan, which doesn't seem to comport, but in some ways that made sense to Warner. Warner was trying to tell the story of Franklin Roosevelt's foreign policy through Theodore Roosevelt in these 2 films. So the Monroe Doctrine in 1939 is a movie, the Monroe Doctrine is, of course, a foreign policy doctrine that has 2 goals. One, to keep European nations from colonizing the Americas any further, but also for the United States to stay out of European affairs. That sounds remarkably like 1939 and the neutrality laws that were passed in the 30s to keep the United States out of war in Europe. Now in 1940, Teddy the Rough Rider comes out, and we're telling a completely different story now. It's not about isolation any longer, it's about intervention. And what better example than the Spanish-American War and the charge up San Juan Heights as the example of intervention that Roosevelt can give to his cousin. So Warner uses Roosevelt in various different ways, and this example is perfect because the timing couldn't be better. There's no reason to explain, films that are released within a year of each other being so different, but they are for this very reason. Now that all begins to change by the 1950s. Motion pictures begin to portray a sort of contextual view of the Cold War in many ways in the 1950s. So patriotism, Americanism, it's on its comeback now in this era. And Theodore Roosevelt, as a consequence, becomes another major figure. And he begins to appear in many American TV shows like My Friend Flicka, Law of the Plainsman, and Bronco. All of these come out in the mid-50s to early 60s. And they tell a particular story of the Cold War and a particular story of the American cowboy. They tell the story of the mythic cowboy, the cowboy of the 1890s to the 1900s, one in which Owen Wister had talked about in his book, The Virginian, one in which Buffalo Bill Cody had depicted in the spectacle of the Wild West shows, or that Frederick Jackson Turner had talked about in his Frontier thesis. And of course, the one that Roosevelt defined and characterized when he was alive. And this was one that symbolized Americanism, democracy, freedom, rugged determinism, which at various times in U.S. history had been cherished. And this time in the 1950s, that was again being cherished. So in all of these TV shows, Roosevelt is the most virtuous figure in American history, either by reenacting scenes like the North Dakota boat thieves in Law of the Plainsman, or just by virtue of him being on the frontier and depicting that image of the cowboy. This doesn't last forever, though, and there's good reason for this. The context changes in the Cold War in the late 1960s, largely with the Vietnam War. And that term that's been used by historians, the Cold War consensus, the notion that communism was a monolithic evil and capitalism was a monolithic good, that begins to change with Vietnam, and motion pictures begin to reflect that as well. And so I want to show you a clip from a movie from 1975 called The Wind and the Lion. Some of you may have seen it because it was a blockbuster film with Sinead O'Connor, with Candice Bergen and the Scottish Sean Connery, thank you. And this film depicts a different cowboy. Not the virtuous cowboy type, but a hasty cowboy, or what Marcus Hanna had called Theodore Roosevelt, that damned cowboy. One that was on the border of the frontier, meaning he was on the border of civilization and savagery. And so it's a much different image.
Is that the bear?
Yes, this is the bear that attacked the horse camp at dawn. He knew that men would be asleep, or at their worst, at dawn. And you know, he injured one of the Indians quite severely. He killed several of the horses, too.
Did you yourself participate in stopping the bear, Mr. President?
Yes, I regret to say.
Why do you regret, Mr. President?
Because he's a fine creature. This is his valley. This valley belonged to the bear, and we're the intruders here. We're accustomed to wild animals taking flight at the sight of men with guns. The American grizzly fears nothing. Not man, not guns, not death.
Do you intend to have this bear as a rug in the White House, Mr. President?
Rug? No. No, I intend to have him stuffed and placed on exhibit at the Smithsonian Institute. The American grizzly bear is a symbol of the American character. Strength, intelligence, ferocity. A little blind and reckless at times, but courageous beyond all doubt. On one other trait goes all previous.
And that, Mr. President?
Loneliness. The bear lives out his life alone. Indomitable, unconquered, but always alone. He has no real allies, only enemies, but none of them are as great as he.
You feel this might be an American trait?
Certainly. The world will never love us. They respect us. They may even grow to fear us. They will never love us. But we have too much audacity. And we're a bit blind and reckless at times, too.
Okay, so this is a much different cowboy figure. It's not quite as virtuous. And you hear some things that Brian Keith, playing Roosevelt here, says. He says, we are the intruders. He's talking about Vietnam. In fact, John Milius, the director, was a Vietnam vet. And he's talking about America being an intruder in Vietnam. He also says, like the bear, we are a little blind and reckless at times, too. Again, a reference in many ways to Vietnam. And so we have the virtuous cowboy of the 1950s and 60s slowly being replaced in the 1970s by this more complex figure that I suppose has good intentions but can't always portray them in the most positive manner. And then moving on to the next few decades, we see a politicizing of Roosevelt, in my mind, through three documentaries. These couldn't be any more different than each other if you've seen them before. The 1986 documentary, The Indomitable Teddy Roosevelt, is produced during the height of the Reagan, not the revolution, I suppose, but Reagan's presidency. And it is very much a Republican Roosevelt that comes out. John Philip Sousa plays the music. It's oozing with patriotism, so much so that George C. Scott, the actor in Patton, is the voice for Theodore Roosevelt. There's fireworks, it forgets an awful lot of history to present this image. Even TV Guide said that this couldn't be a more Reagan Roosevelt. Now skip ahead 10 years to TR, the PBS American Experience production produced during Bill Clinton's tenure as president. This is a very liberal TR all of a sudden, one in which the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt was inspired by the Square Deal of Theodore Roosevelt. And then skip ahead to 2003 to Teddy Roosevelt and American Lion, and you have a unique synergy of the two past documentaries, where Bill Clinton is interviewed alongside Karl Rove, both of them saying why Theodore Roosevelt is their inspiration. And so you have this transformation from Republican to Democrat to actually Roosevelt at this stage in the 2000s is he's anyone's. He's bipartisan now. He's risen above politics in many ways. So this brings me into contemporary motion pictures before I open this up, I guess, to questions. And I'm going to try and, throw a spanner in the works with The Simpsons, partly because there's high school students here. So this is something that you can at least remember, The Simpsons. And in 2012, there was a full feature-length Simpsons episode devoted to Theodore Roosevelt. And I think it's changing the way we think about him, and I want to show that to you now.
Hello? Calling from England? Certainly I can put you on speakerphone.
I am Edith Nickertwist, an eccentric widow. For this masterpiece, I bid $1,000.
Oh. Sold to the mysterious and unverified Mrs. Nickertwist. Why do I believe everything I hear in a British accent?
He has thrust upon us the motley of the tomfool!
If you think it's so easy to handle Bart Simpson, why don't you do it yourself?
Woo!
You tell him, Seymour!
Fine. I will personally take over Bart Simpson's education, and for once, that boy is going to learn something. So, Simpson, you'll be studying with me now.
Same garbage, different dumpster.
We'll start with American history. Now, I'm sure you know who these gentlemen are.
Dollar bill guy, $5 bill guy, sex guy, Will Ferrell, black guy.
Bart, what if I told you there was a president who was an actual cowboy?
I'd act like I'm interested, but inside, I'd be bored.
That's as good a place to start as any.
Great fundamental issue now before our people can be stated briefly. It is, are the American people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves? I believe they are. My opponents do not.
Hey, this Roosevelt guy was sort of interesting. Did you know he was a colonel in the army?
You don't say.
And one time during a speech, he was shot by a saloon keeper, but Teddy finished his speech before heading to the hospital.
I'm mad at you for some reason.
Teddy! I've never said this before, but I'd like to learn more.
You know, I hate to say this, Bart, but the library is about to close.
Really? I wanted to learn more about trust busting. Take that, Standard Oil!
Tomorrow, son. Tomorrow.
Well, I've learned a lot today. Now to go home and let TV slowly rot it all away.
Not so fast. Teddy Roosevelt believed you could learn from books, but he also believed you can learn just as much from the out-of-doors.
I thought teachers only went outdoors to smoke and cry.
Yes. Son, have you ever seen a horse your father wasn't betting on?
No, sir.
Come with me. So, Bart, what have you learned so far?
Well, when horses poop, they don't stop. They just keep walking.
Yes. Well, here's another fun fact for you. All around you is a national park created by Teddy Roosevelt.
Wow. In here, I thought God created all this. Thanks for setting me straight. A man who is good enough to shed his blood for the country is good enough to be given a square deal afterwards. Just quoting our 26th president, Lise, you could use a little TR in your life.
Please. I went through my TR phase in first grade. Now I realize that the greatest Roosevelt is Franklin.
Boulder Dash. Teddy Teddy Roosevelt protected America's wildlife.
Yeah, so he could shoot it himself. Franklin Roosevelt led this country through the Depression and World War II. Face on a dime!
Face on a mountain! Sir, of all the books and movies about Teddy Roosevelt, which would you say is the most informative?
No question. Night at the museum.
One or two?
Pick your pick. You can't go wrong.
You're all laughing at that, but I asked my students, I have a module for senior students in England that is just Theodore Roosevelt. And I asked them the first day what they thought about, what was the first recollection they had. A night at the museum was what they said. Now, they're not American, so I can forgive them that. But I think there's a story here about conservation that's coming out in motion pictures more and more, be it A Night at the Museum, where the backdrop is the Museum of Natural History in New York, or be it this Simpsons episode where they do talk an awful lot about conservation. And that would gel very well with some of the newest books that have come out, like Douglas Brinkley's The Wilderness Warrior. However, where we go from here is even more interesting. I'll just say one thing, that Ken Burns' documentary is coming out this year, 12 months from now, I think, in November, called The Roosevelts, which will certainly have an impact on how we view TR. But Edmund Morris's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, is being considered for a biopic, where Martin Scorsese has rumored to be considered as the director, and his young acting protege, Leonardo DiCaprio, is being rumored as the possible TR character. Now, that's been a rumor. It was supposed to start filming this year. However, it's been put on hold, so I don't know what exactly is going on with that. But just imagine for a moment what that would do to our conception of TR for the next generation of Americans. Thanks very much.
That was great. So questions for Michael Cullinane? Let me just say one thing about that Hagedorn film. I know you're going to look at our version of it, but most of the people here know that a few years ago we found the film and had it digitally remastered, and then we made a documentary about the making of the documentary. And it's really charming in many ways, because we found someone in Oregon who has an identical Bell and Howell camera to the one that Herman Hagedorn used when he was here. And so that film is a really important part of the work of the Theodore Roosevelt Center, and we're eager for you to take a look at it.
I can't wait to. I mean, that film itself, for being 100 years old almost, it holds up really well, and the images that are in it are remarkable. And for anyone living in Medora, I can imagine this is just such a great nostalgic item to be able to look back in time. I mean, I certainly can't do it from where I grew up, so I mean, it's a great thing to have for anyone that's from this area to be able to do that.
And you were talking about lip syncing, and we did hire a deaf woman from the Portland area to read what she could of the people in the film, and she had a hard time with it because of a whole range of reasons. But at the beginning of the documentary, there's a picture of Roosevelt, a film clip of Roosevelt going up in an airplane. He was the first American president to go into an airplane for, I think, a flight of 2 minutes and 22 seconds in St. Louis in 1910, and she read his lips, and when he gets off the plane, in the still, the silent picture caption, he says, "Bully, it was the great moment of my life." What he actually said was, "I won't be doing that anytime soon." So we were hoping to get all of them and find out what actually all of Margaret Roberts and Sylvain and Joe Ferris are actually saying as they did that film. The Ken Burns film, I'm one of the advisors and I'm in it, and I can tell you that it's a nuanced portrait of Theodore Roosevelt. But because the Burns film is 14 hours long and it's about Eleanor, FDR, and TR, TR is really only in the first 3 episodes, and he's sort of seen as the warm-up act for the great ones. So Ken Burns is a New Deal kind of guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Questions? Here. TR and John Ford.
Yeah, I mean, I think Roosevelt, in many ways, we were talking about in Stephen's discussion and in Rogers as well, about the likelihood that Roosevelt could appreciate different kinds of art or culture and yet at the same moment be critical of it. And that would probably be the case there. But he was a great proponent of motion pictures in his time, which, I mean, I think the Library of Congress collection really fleshes that out in the sense that, okay, he wasn't the first president on film. Cleveland was, and McKinley appeared in several speeches. But Roosevelt was the first one to realize that harnessing that power would allow him to forge an image that America could understand. And successive presidents have done that as a result of Roosevelt realizing that, I think. He was the first to do that. So film and how people have used film afterwards, I think he would have appreciated the message that they were trying to get, sorry, not necessarily the message, but the fact that they were trying to get a message across in there.
There was a question behind there.
I need to come talk to you afterwards, and you need to tell me a little bit about this story, because that sounds intriguing.
So Victor Hugo Stickney was Roosevelt's friend who patched him up after the boat thieves incident. His daughter Dorothy, famous actress, she had an enormous affection for this institution, and her husband then got that performance started when it was stalled. So that's Dr. Carl Larson, who'll be happy to.
That's great, thanks.
To explain it. Go ahead.
Oh.
So instead of DiCaprio, who would be your TR?
I am an academic. I am definitely not a casting agent. I really don't know. I mean, it depends on, I think it depends on what you want to see in Roosevelt. If you want to see a rugged Roosevelt, maybe you depict, I don't know, you get, gosh, I don't know. Daniel Day-Lewis would be the statesman, maybe, because he did Lincoln. He could probably do a great job on Roosevelt's accent.
What is the British students' perception of TR in Newcastle?
Yeah, I think it changes. I think there's been what we call the Obama effect in American studies in Britain, where there was a major slump in American studies during the early 2000s, and after 2008 it picked up. Ironically, I guess as Obama's popularity is waning now a little bit, so is American studies recruitment in Britain. But Roosevelt remains remarkably a powerful figure. It recruits very well in my classes, and other people that use him as a symbol for the Gilded Age and Progressive Era that I know, other academics say that their recruitment figures are quite good. But that's more, I think, because he's risen above the politics now. He's become this bipartisan figure that Republicans and Democrats alike can, and we have in Europe the Roosevelt Study Center, which was a bipartisan effort by Dutch folks to talk more about the lineage of the Roosevelts coming from Holland. And it was actually the ambassador of the Netherlands at the time, L. Paul Bremer, who said to the director of the Roosevelt Study Center in the Netherlands, make sure you have the other Roosevelt in there as well, because they were just planning the Franklin Roosevelt Center. But by bringing them both together, it made it a much more powerful combination, and today remains one of the most important centers in Europe for the study of Roosevelt.
We have time for just a couple more if people have questions. Here's a question. Why is there such a, I mean, I would think given Roosevelt's larger-than-life persona, that there would be hundreds of feature films about Theodore Roosevelt, and you've scouted them out. He's not that well represented in American film. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, there's something like 100 motion pictures, cinema depictions that you can find, but you're right. They're not particularly leading roles, and I think that's probably more in the sense that by being a character actor, you can portray those elements that you want to portray. So there's a really great 1950s production called Fancy Pants with Bob Hope and Lucille Ball, and Roosevelt has a sizable part in it, but it's this kind of kitschy 1950 cowboy image that I was talking about, and there's no depth to it. So it's just used there for a bit of comedy. And in other films like My Girl Tissa, Roosevelt is used at the end of the film to talk about American immigration policies, and he's dropped in as a liberal at the last minute. So I think in many ways he's just been dropped in, which is a shame. And maybe this new film, the feature-length biopic on Edmund Morris's book, is a chance to see Roosevelt over a much longer period of time with him as the leading character.
And you know, the work that we're doing here in North Dakota is to try to recenter Roosevelt, to take the caricature out of the story as much as possible and restore him as a man of letters, as a thinker, as a cultural icon, as a major political figure, and so on. But you know, if you look at The Simpsons or you look at Night in the Museum, it's almost impossible not to go right back to caricature with this guy.
Absolutely. I mean, The Night at the Museum is the worst caricature. I mean, the other one is that film, The Wind and the Lion, which is a take on the Moroccan crisis of 1904-05. And you know, it's supposed to be a bald Greek man that gets kidnapped. And in the film, it's Candice Bergen. You know, it's supposed to be a Moroccan bandit, and in the film, it's what's his name again? Sean Connery with the Scottish accent. I mean, you know, they take great liberties with image, and that's got to stop, I think. Maybe, actually, I was thinking in the Simpsons episode Bart was looking up on the internet some stuff about Roosevelt. It would have been great if you could get a tagline in there, trcenter.org, you know.
You know, why didn't we think of that? You know,
Were you? Yeah.
We could pirate it, you know. Thank you so much, Michael Cullinane.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Cheers. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks very much. Just take